have said in the debates. And so it's a little tricky. If two debaters are entirely evenly matched and they answer all their arguments, it does a little bit come down to who you may agree with slightly more. However, one of the things that is used in order to make debates a little bit more objective is anything that the other team doesn't answer in their next available speech is considered conceded and just becomes truth. So if I make the argument that North Korea is going to launch nuclear weapons at us tomorrow, and the other team doesn't answer it, as judges you have to take that argument as being true, regardless of your personal belief. And in the ballots, there's a part of the ballot that says, like, arguments I would have liked to see said by the other debaters. There's many rounds where I'm like, I vote this way, I disagree, here's all the things I wish that you have said, but you didn't. And so you could use that as an opportunity to educate and express your opinion, but when you're voting for what the debaters have said and not all the arguments that you could have thought of, all right? And so if somebody doesn't answer something in the next available speech, it's conceded. Some concessions don't matter at all. Like if I was like, it's snowing today, and it's not, right? But the other team concedes that, then everyone has to believe for the rest of the round that it's snowing today. If there's some way I could tie that into being, a reason to vote for me, then maybe it does get you your ballot. But it probably, that does not matter as much as if they concede that North Korea is going to strike us tomorrow. Yeah.
So you say next available speech if it's brought up like 2 speeches later.
It's too late. Too late. And so as a debater, one thing that you should do, if the other team doesn't answer your speech, you should be like, they've conceded this point, which means even if you don't agree, you have to accept this as truth. Or once they've conceded this point, these things mean, this is why it matters, and then you implicate it, right? Because if I'm just like, North Korea will strike us tomorrow, but I don't explain why that means the judges should vote for me, I could still lose that debate even if that truth statement exists. I would have to explain why having first strike capability is important in order to be able to counter that threat or something to that effect. So you need to tie conceded arguments to an actual argument. Yep.
Last questions. Let's say if you speak first and I'm speaking second for the opposite,
Yep.
then does that mean that I shouldn't focus on, I should just focus on my arguments, and then when I'm responding to you in the shorter amount of time, then that's when I respond?
You have both. So it's like the affirmative starts off, here's my speech. This is why I think we should restrict the president's trade authority. The 1NC should both be responding to those points, but then also coming up with other overarching arguments for why they should lose the debate.
Okay.
And so I'll get into that later, different negative tactics that people could use to respond to that, so that way you have your own ground, but then you're also playing defense against them. Just like with sports, offense, defense is the same thing in debate. You want to be like, you're wrong on these issues, however, there's this larger issue that's more important than all these things, so even if you're right about everything you've said, I should still win the debate round because of this larger issue. So you want to be doing that, yeah?
When you're saying for the 1NC, when they start talking, you're saying you should bring up other arguments, or you're saying you should put out there defenses that they might use against you?
We'll get to it after I get past this, but there's off-case arguments which are slight tangents to what the affirmative might say. Like you might have, so for instance, if they started saying we should restrict Trump's authority, the 1NC could say, well, in order to pass that restriction in Congress, Trump will get, access to being able to fund his border wall. Border wall funding is bad because of, and you insert that, and then you say the border wall is worse than the restriction that you end up having. And so the affirmative never was interested in talking about the border wall. They were saying we should restrict Trump's trade authority. And then suddenly the negative is linked that to how border wall funding takes place and reasons for why that's bad. And so that's sort of like a tangent, but it's still relevant to something that the affirmative might end up causing. Right, and so I'll get into that in a little bit, those are sort of generic ways to approach negative argumentation. Counterplans are another example. It's like the affirmative says we should do this, the negative say this is a better option to do this and get the same results. All right. Something that you should notice is that this part in the debate, the negative speaks back to back, which is the one part in the debate where you don't have to answer everything in each speech. So if there was 5 arguments in the 1AC, the 1NC has to answer them all, otherwise they're conceded. The 2AC is going to have to answer them all if they're conceded. When we get to the negative block, you could divide that up. So the 2NC could talk about 3 of the issues, and the 1NR could talk about the other 2 issues, and nothing's considered conceded because the negative team is speaking back to back. But what this means is the negative essentially is getting 5 minutes to talk, and then the 1AR has to answer everything in that 5 minutes in 2 minutes. So you have less than half the amount of time to answer everything that was said here, or you've conceded points. And so if you're thinking about when we get to partners, what makes for, what speaker position you want to have. 1ARs are people who are really good at prioritizing things and be like, even if this is true, it doesn't matter because of these other things. And so you start making strategic concessions. Just like in chess, you're willing to sacrifice some pieces in order to advance your other pieces. In debate, you have to be able to be like, we'll agree with these points, it doesn't matter because of these other issues. And so 1AR is someone who's able to strategically figure out what can be conceded and what can't be conceded in an individual debate round. Quiz question is, what is the difference between constructive and rebuttal speeches? The difference is that in the rebuttal speeches, you can't make new arguments or bring up new evidence. All right? And so generally what ends up happening is that in these constructive speeches, both teams put out any evidence that they think they might need to use and all the arguments that they might think that they might want to make. But by the rebuttals, it starts funneling down because the speech times are less and people are picking which are their best arguments. So if there was 5 at the start of the debate, at the end of the debate, the 2AR or the 2-1R only has to win one of them to win the debate round. They just have to prove that that one argument that they win is the most important argument in that round. All right, so quiz question is just what's the difference between rebuttals and constructive speeches? In the rebuttals, you can't make new arguments. The other thing in relationship to judging is that if one team concedes something, but the other team doesn't bring it up, it just leaves the round. So you need to make sure that you talk about things in every speech, and the judges are really comparing what the negative team says for why they should win versus what the affirmative team says for why they should win. And so even if they said some really good stuff early on, if they're not talking about it in the last speech, as a judge you can't vote on that because it's not what they're telling you that you should be voting on at the end of the debate round. Okay, so it's really these last 2 speeches that make or break the individual debates. 2ARs are people who are really good liars, if you're looking for, a personality trait. And the reason why I say this is because what is a new argument or what is considered conceded is a very murky gray territory. So if you could say, my partner said blah, 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 and that means yada, 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 and those 2 things are different, but the judges don't recognize that they're different, there's no one after this speech to tell the judges this is a new argument. So it's entirely up to the judges to determine if what the 2AR says is new or not. And some people, it's really easy to be like, that's new and that's new, so I'm not going to pay attention to it. Other people are really good at sort of morphing their words. And like I'm sure you've all gotten into arguments with friends, and it's like they start saying one thing and you keep talking to them, and slowly they end up saying the same thing you were saying, but they've just slowly moved what they've said. And some people are really good at it, and so you don't notice until you're like an hour into the conversation that they're saying something entirely different. Other people are really bad at that, and it's really easy to sort of call them out. So if you're one of the people who are good at sort of changing your words and mutating them, you make for a good 2AR because you can make a bunch of new arguments and the negative team never has the opportunity to respond to it. Good 2-1Rs are more structural thinkers who are easily able to tell the judge, these are the 3 things the affirmative said, don't let them say anything else, don't let them twist the words, they've conceded these 2 points, these 2 points are the most important, here's why. And sort of able to do that so that way it makes sure that judges are accountable for the types of things that are said or not said, versus someone who's really able to sort of like create a little bit more ethos to it. All right. So there are questions on order of the speeches, who cross-examined who, time limits, difference between constructive or rebuttals, or any of the other sort of things I've said. Yeah.
Did you talk about constructive speeches?
Constructive speeches is where you just present your initial arguments, right? And so there you can make any arguments you want, and bring in any evidence that you want. So like, it is entirely okay for the 2AC and the 2NC to bring in entirely new arguments that were not previously talked about in the 1AC and the 1NC and use new evidence. It is not okay for these speeches to start bringing in new arguments and new evidence. All right? Yeah?
We're allowed to hold notes and paper.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, you should. Very often, these 2 speeches are just entirely pre-scripted with somebody reading off the script that's sort of presenting the evidence and the speech that they've wanted to have. And on the syllabus where it says 1AC assignment and 1NC assignment, what you're sending me will be your 1AC and your 1NC that will be either literally what you would read or the bullet points and the references to evidence that you'll then speak. So last semester, the vast majority of the class just read verbatim. And then there was like a small percentage of the class that was sort of more performative and sort of like, just gave themselves bullet points in order to sort of talk off the cuff versus like, reading a script. But it's entirely fine to just read the scripts here you know, and then at the same point, it is okay to use your laptop, access the internet, use evidence and stuff like that. The only thing you can't do is you can't just like communicate with people outside the room and your friends in order to be like, oh, they said this, what should I use to respond? It's just you and your partner at that individual point in time. All right. Any other questions? All right. Something that you should know about debate at this point is that everything within the activity itself is fundamentally debatable, and all the things that I'm telling you right now are just essentially norms. And so if you want to get up here in the 1AC and say that this is a bad resolution, and instead of talking about this, we should talk about the fact that we're debating on stolen land and our first priority is to give the land back to Native Americans opposed to benefiting our education off of systems of genocide, and you could convince the judges that breaking the rule of this resolution is more important than debating about this resolution, you can win the debate round. So your goal at the end is to convince the judges, who will be myself and your peers, that you deserve to win the debate round. Norms are ways where we're able to come together and be like, okay, this is what we've agreed upon to debate because this is what Joe told us on, you know, lecture day, this is what the resolution is. And so, you know, last semester and almost every semester, the entirety of the class debated the resolution until we got to elimination rounds, and then a couple of people were like, oh, let's maybe do something a little bit more creative. And so they did that. But if you're someone who's like, I like to be creative, I would rather read poetry than read evidence, and I'm going to use a more ethos-based appeal to try and convince people to vote for me and then make arguments for why poetry is more important than using statistics in traditional politics, you can make that argument, and if you can convince people of that argument, you'll be able to win the debate round. You'll get ballots from everybody, like I scan them and I put them online, so after your debate you'll see everybody's comments, and over the semester you'll be judged by your peers multiple times, you'll be judged by me multiple times, and we'll all be giving you feedback on how to better get our ballots, and so you can sort of nuance your arguments and respond and adapt to the judges that you have. Most of life is judge adaptation. Like there are rules, there are laws, there are various different things like that, but you're also able to work around rules and laws depending on the bureaucrat that you come in contact with. And so figuring out how to adapt to the person who you're interacting with is essential in life. And so while it's your peers judging you and there's a split in terms of people who might be liberal or might be conservative or people who might not be politically motivated, all of those things are people who you'll have to adapt to in real life, and figuring out ways to interact with them, either traditionally or untraditionally, is important. And so debate sort of encourages you to figure out ways to innovatively inform and interact with others. All right, any questions? All right, so next thing is what you have to prove in the 1AC. So in the 1AC, you have to prove that your argument is the SHIT, S-H-I-T. And the quiz question is, what is the SHIT? It's an acronym, and so you have to know what each one of these letters stand for and be able to give a one-sentence definition based upon it. The first thing you have to prove is inherency. And what inherency is evidence or arguments that prove that you're not the status quo. So if the United States didn't have a first-use nuclear posture right now, you cannot restrict the president's authority because the president doesn't have the authority for first use because our nuclear posture is no first use. It's not. Right now our nuclear posture is a first use, or is the willingness to use nuclear weapons first. Even if another state does not have nuclear weapons, or even if another state hasn't launched nuclear weapons at the United States, we reserve the right to use nuclear forces first if it's a security threat. In relationship to withdrawing from Article 2 treaty powers, there is more of a legal debate about how much the president could just withdraw from treaties that have already been signed into law by Congress. And so here, you would have to read some evidence that says, currently, the president could withdraw from any treaty that they want, and while might be challenged, will be upheld by the courts that is within the president's power. So you basically have to prove as the affirmative, you're not the status quo. The affirmative's responsibility is to change the status quo. The next thing you have to prove is harms. Why is the status quo bad? Like, what is a bad thing that will happen? What does having a first-use nuclear posture mean? Well, it means other countries without nuclear weapons worry that the United States might use their nuclear weapons on our nuclear weapons on them first, and so it sometimes can inspire other countries who want to have nuclear weapons because the U.S. is a little bit more hesitant to strike a country or go to war with a country that might use nuclear weapons against us. So having a no first-use policy might be able to create more global certainty and decrease the likelihood of like accidental nuclear war. We've come really close to nuclear war with Russia a couple of times because of weather balloons and faulty alert systems, where it's like literally a matter of minutes And if either side did not decide to double check the information coming, they thought a weapon was on their way, and it's now or never for us to use our nuclear weapons to respond. And so making sure you actually are hit first with nuclear weapons can avoid things like accidental nuclear conflict that happens because of earthquakes or other things that make people think, oh, this could have been a nuclear strike, we better launch now before all of our second strike capabilities disappear. So harms, in that case, accidental nuclear war. It doesn't have to be that as well. For instance, just, treaty powers could deal with things like climate change. Things like trade could deal with things like economic inequality. You essentially just need to have a reason for why the status quo is bad, and at the end of the debate as the affirmative, you're going to be arguing that that reason is a big enough reason to vote for you over the other team. Next thing you need to prove is solvency, that your solution to the problem, that Congress or the judicial branch would actually be able to solve that problem. If not having a first use posture, if we had no first use, we're still going to cause other countries to proliferate nuclear weapons. There's a bunch of evidence out there that said if the US doesn't have a first use policy, that Japan would start making nuclear weapons for themselves, because the only reason why they don't is because they're under the United States' nuclear umbrella right now. So if we change our policy, maybe Japan starts proliferating nuclear weapons, and so it doesn't solve your harms of other countries getting nuclear weapons, because once Japan does it, there'll be a lot of countries in Asia that are going to be like, oh, we better get nuclear weapons, and it creates an Asian nuclear arms race, which would not be good for the world. So you just need to prove your solution will solve for the harms that you're talking about. Generally in a debate round, these things aren't like 100% because the other team is answering it. So it's not that you're going to win 100% certainty that you'll be able to solve your harms, but that you win enough of a certainty that it's worthwhile doing it, right? So it's like when you argue, with your friends about how you want to go downtown and they're like, I want to study. Obviously, it's not 100% chance that they're going to fail or get 100 on the test if they go downtown or not, but it's how likely it is that they will fail that test or get a better grade by staying home and studying versus going downtown. And so it's just cost-benefit analysis and sort of weighing out what's the chance of actually solving the harms and how big are these harms. The last thing that you have to prove is that your solution, the way you solve, is topical, which means that you use the resolution to be able to solve the problem. Now again, everything's debatable, so if you can prove that being on topic doesn't matter, you can win that debate round. It creates creativity, it allows debates not to be stale. Some semesters, by the time we've debated this topic 3-4 times, everyone's like, this is so boring, I just want to learn something else. However, if everyone can come in and say whatever they want, and you have to debate against that, that's going to be really unfair for negative teams because they don't know what they're going to say, and so you don't have any time to prepare. How much you care about fairness versus interesting or creative education is something that you'll all decide as people end up debating about it, if they end up debating about it, and things like that. Yeah?
What's the difference between solvency and topical?
Topical is that your solution solves. So if I said Russia should take away all of the United States' nuclear weapons, well, that would restrict the president's authority to, use nuclear weapons first. However, it's not a topical solution because the resolution says the United States federal government should. So I'm using the incorrect actor in that regards, right? Another example is that if I said the president should issue an executive order saying that it's now Congress's responsibility to determine all trade negotiations, that is not a topical solution because it doesn't use statutory or judicial limitations, right? And so what it's meant to be is that the affirmative proves that they're defending what is the affirmative ground and proving that resolution to be true, and then everything else would be negative ground. So if the negative team wanted to say it should be an executive order opposed to Congress, that could be a debate about which branch is better suited to actually enact these restrictions, but it's not the negative ground to be able to use the executive branch in this regards. Okay? Any questions? Yep. So topical means that you use a method to solve that affirms the resolution, that you're on topic, that you do what the resolution says. Whereas solvency just shows that what you do solves. So it is possible to solve by doing something that is not on topic. Like, we can't use Russia, we can't use the executive branch to restrict authority as the affirmative because the topic says statutory or judicial and says the United States. So even if those might solve the harms, it's not the affirmative's ability to do that because the resolution says that. So in the 1AC, you have to prove you're not the status quo is bad, and that you have a solution that affirms the resolution. And so that's all presented in your first affirmative constructive. And so generally people will say something like, currently, this is what's going on in the status quo, read a piece of evidence. what this causes, and then read a piece of evidence for why that thing that is bad, and then say, therefore, we propose that the United States Congress should have the authority to determine whether or not we use our nuclear weapons first, which would be an on-topic response, and then read evidence that says, congressional authority helps secure the world because it means that it's not one person who decides if we use nuclear weapons, but it's all of Congress, so there's more global certainty over the question of nuclear weapons, which stems proliferation. So it's, just laying out what the status quo is, why it's bad, what your solution is, and then why that solution solves. All right? Yep.
Do you need to cite your evidence, just like at the end of debate?
Debatable. So, you all are people who are undergraduates who have intelligence and are informed about things. Your ability to talk about, Article 2 treaties and international nuclear powers are not irrelevant. You're more informed than, say, like a middle schooler or a high schooler. Some of you might be very well informed. But when people are judging a debate, if you're using your own arguments without any evidence, and the other team is citing nuclear scientists or professors or people in the government, and they're saying, you should prefer my arguments because it comes from qualified sources, just instead of just being someone making something up, judges are probably going to default to saying the evidence is more qualified than a random undergraduate. But that doesn't mean you have to use evidence for everything you said. I've seen many people, quote organizations that are biased on the extreme left and the extreme right, and somebody who's just intelligent just explains why that evidence is incorrect and attacks the source and wins the debate round because evidence does not necessarily determine everything. And so it's a matter of sort of coupling evidence with your own intelligence and using evidence to help support your arguments, but not necessarily be the entirety of your arguments. Generally, constructives use a lot of evidence because you can't bring up new evidence in the rebuttals, and so you could save all of your analytical arguments and your thoughts in your head to be doing that interaction later on, but you can't be like, and here's another source that agrees with me, because that has to be in the constructive speeches so that way the other team has enough time to respond to it. All right? But what is a credible source in debate is debatable, right? Is the president more qualified to talk about presidential powers than a professor at a university? Professors are just ivory tower intellectuals to a lot of extent. So they study things and then they say, this is what I believe is true. Do you trust that? Or do you trust someone who's actually a governmental official who is actually, dealing with the day-to-days of being the president or being within the White House? Do you trust, when we're talking about economic equality, the person living in economic inequality who's experiencing that firsthand? Or do you trust an economist who, might have a six-figure income who's then talking about how economic equality happens based upon their models? And there's arguments on both sides for why you would trust one versus the other, and those are things that you would actively debate about. And so even if you think, oh, this is obviously more trustworthy than the other thing, if the other team debates and says, your evidence isn't qualified because it comes from the Cato Institute and this is a biased source, and the other team doesn't respond to it, you might be like, I think Cato is a fine institute and is able to produces a lot of good qualified evidence, but I can't say that because the other team explained why it's biased, so I'm going to discount that evidence in this round and prefer the other evidence. So you actually debate about the quality of the evidence and the arguments that are being made. So literally everything is debatable, and if you don't debate it, then it's sort of left uncontested. So, if I read, evidence from, Breitbart or, some far left source, it's like, and you are like, this is just unqualified because it's just like a blog where people are clearly putting into their political spins on it, but the other team never challenges it, that evidence is truth for the debate round. So even if you disagree with the source as a judge, if it is not challenged by the other team, that source becomes truth. Right? So it's like somebody's reading, Marx and saying that we need to be advocating communism, and you're like, Marx is an incredibly unqualified source that, discounts all of these historical analysis, but the other team never brings that up. You're stuck being like, Marx says is true for this individual debate round. And on your ballot, when it's like arguments that you wish they would have said, you could write all you want about why Marx is unqualified, or all you want about why Breitbart is a bad source, and maybe the people will debate about that in the future, but it cannot be the reason for why you vote one way or the other way. All right. Questions? Yep.
If you were to bring something up and then you feel like maybe in the next round you wish you hadn't, you can discount it, and they can't concede it for the rest.
Do you mean round or speech?
Sorry.
Speech. Yeah. I mean, if you bring something up here, they have to answer it or it's become conceded. In this speech, if they conceded two of your points but you don't think they're important, you don't have to bring them back up, and you can just go for the other parts. But if they've conceded it, even if it might not be your best argument, you're like, maybe I should go ahead and use that anyhow because it's now truth. So even if I don't personally believe this, it's truth for this debate round, and maybe this will cause me to win. And so as much as debate helps us learn about truth, the act of an individual debate round is not necessarily truth seeking. It's more game playing and strategic thinking than it is about figuring out what is the true argument at the end, because sometimes you might go for arguments that you don't believe in because it's what's strategically beneficial in an individual debate round. Like in sports, you have a lot of players on the field, and you go in there with a strategy of I'm going to get the ball to this player, or, and this will be the way to score. But if they have good defense on that player, you go to the B strat and use one of the other players that exist on the field. And sort of the same thing. It's like you might not have liked your third argument, but if they really screw it up, maybe now it's a better way to go about doing it than your number one argument that they put a lot of answers to. So you got to sort of figure that out. If your number three argument is really just trash, you probably shouldn't have it in that speech at all. Right? Other questions? Okay. So, in the 1NC speech, you can do either what's known as on-case arguments or off-case arguments. On-case arguments are where you specifically respond to the ship. You say, there's no harms, you're defending the status quo, there's no solvency, you're not topical. You're directly responding to these things. Off-case arguments are tangents that are related to the affirmative but are sort of also entirely different. The quiz question is, what are the four types of off-case arguments that you could run? The first type of off-case argument is known as a disadvantage or a disad or just a DA for short. And you're expected to be able to give a definition for it. What a disadvantage is a chain of events that's set in motion by the affirmative that causes something bad to happen. So just something the affirmative causes that results in something bad. You could write A causes B, causes C, and C is a bad thing. So it's just a chain of events that the affirmative sets in motion that causes something bad to happen. My examples that I gave earlier would be like a trade-off disad. Your plan is going to cost $7 million. Right now, we're strapped for cash. That means it's going to come out of education. When we hurt U.S. education, it puts us behind in terms of like economic competitiveness because we stop being innovative, which hurts U.S. leadership and kills our economy. And so the affirmative team never thought they were going to be talking about education, competitiveness, innovation, or anything like that. But you've shown that what they do causes this chain of events to go in motion, right? The affirmative never wanted to talk about Japan proliferating nuclear weapons, but the negative made an argument that NFU, no first use, will cause Japan to rearm and have nuclear weapons, which will cause an Asian arms race. And so a chain of events that the affirmative sets in motion that results in something negative happening. All right? Yep.
The question was, what are the four types of what?
Off-case arguments. Yep. And the reason why it's off-case is because generally you use one sheet of paper for the affirmative, and then for each off-case argument you use a separate sheet of paper, so it's literally just taking notes on it off the affirmative case. So it's sort of setting up your own areas of offense. All right. There are millions of different types of disadvantages that you're able to run. You can make arguments that explain that, like, if we restrict the president's authority to declare national states of emergency, that this means that Congress, every time that there might be something that goes wrong, is going to get into a bipartisan battle, which will create increased gridlock, which will then stop the ability to pass another piece of legislation because all of that legislation will fall off the docket because they spend so much time debating this. Now, the affirmative guarantees that they get their plan to pass, but if it's going to push other pieces of legislation off that docket in order for them to debate and pass your piece of policy, the negative can make arguments that it pushes off this other agenda item that's really high up there, maybe healthcare or whatever else that you want to say. In a disadvantage, there's a couple of things that you have to prove. The quiz question will randomly ask, like, give me this, what you have to prove within a disadvantage or within a critique or a counterplan or a procedural argument, and you have to list the steps. You don't have to give definitions for them. The first thing you have to prove is uniqueness, which is proving that the disadvantage is not going to happen in the status quo and that the affirmative uniquely causes it. If education was already not going to be funded, the affirmative team can't trade off with education funding. If the wall was already going to be funded, it's not something that the affirmative would cause to get funding in order to horse trade for a restriction of power. So you have to prove currently education is going to get funded. Currently, Japan is not going to rearm nuclear weapons. Then you need to have a link the affirmative plan is going to cost $7 trillion, or the affirmative plan weakens our nuclear umbrella, which makes Japan uncertain and makes them interested in nuclear weapons, right? So it's not happening in the status quo. The affirmative causes this to happen. Then an internal link. Once Japan gets nuclear weapons, it'll create an arms race in Asia. Or once we cut spending for education, it'll hurt our competitiveness or innovation. So it's just like the B subpoint, the internal link in the chain. And then an impact. Why is that bad? Absent innovation and economic competitiveness, China replaces us as a global economic leader, which will cause the United States to go into poverty and make it impossible for us to have an effective military to help secure the rest of the world and stop, battles from happening. All right. Yep.
Can you repeat the question that this is the answer to?
So in the quiz, I'll be like, what are the 4 steps to a disadvantage? And you would have to write uniqueness, link, internal link, impact. You don't need definitions for these. All right. But I might ask, when we get to the other off-case arguments, what are the 4 steps you have to prove in a critique? So I'll ask like 2 or 3 of them, not all of them, but you should know all of them. All right. You do need to know a definition of a disadvantage. All right.
Can you say
The definition of a chain of events set in motion by the affirmative that causes something bad to happen. You could also just write A arrow B arrow C is bad, and that's okay. Or you could write the affirmative causes something negative to happen. So it's like however formalized you want to have it, but you just have to show that it's something the affirmative causes that's negative. Okay? Any questions on disadvantages? No? Okay. The next type of off-case argument is known as a counterplan, or CP for short. And what a counterplan is an opportunity cost to the affirmative plan. For people who don't know what opportunity cost is, it's something that you lose when you do something else. So when you take this class, the opportunity cost is every other class from 10:05 to 11:30. And so you can't take this class and another class at that same time slot. You can take a class at 11:40 to 1:05 because that is not an opportunity cost to this class. And so if people are like, oh, you should take Joe's media and politics class, it's like, okay, well we can do those together because there's no reason why we can't. If someone's like, oh, you should take, I don't know what other classes go on at this time, but if somebody else is like, you should take this class at 10:05, now you have to make a choice of this or that. So a counterplan has to not be something that can be done at the same time as the affirmative plan. So it's got to be an opportunity cost too. All right. Within a counterplan, there's a couple of things you have to prove or do. The first thing is that you need to have a text. What it is that you say the counterplan is going to do. Right? So if you want to have the president issue an executive order, you would literally say, now I'm going to propose the counterplan. Instead of having Congress restrict the president's authority, the president should issue an executive order declaring that no first use will now be the U.S.'s nuclear posture opposed to the first use posture. And so you say very clearly what you're proposing instead of what the affirmative is doing. All right. The next thing that you do is that you have to prove that it's mutually exclusive. And this is where you prove that there is an opportunity cost. Extra credit on this one is what are the 2 ways that you could prove the counterplan is mutually exclusive? You could say based upon it textually. And so what I mean by that is you could run a counterplan that says we should dissolve the United States and have anarchy. We could not textually have anarchy and Congress restricting the president because it assumes that Congress exists or the Supreme Court exists. So you literally can't have an anarchical system and Congress at the same time. So you just cannot do those 2 things at the same time, right? So they're textually incompatible. The other way you can do it is based on net benefits, which is where you prove that even if it's theoretically possible, it's not desirable. So theoretically, Congress could say, we take authority away from the president to withdraw from Article 2 treaties, and the president could issue an executive order saying, I no longer have this power and I defer to Congress to be able to do this. You could theoretically do those things at the same time, but it might not be desirable to do them at the same time, often because of the disadvantage. So if you're going to say, passing legislation in Congress is going to cause horse trading, which is going to then end up causing some other bad piece of legislation to get passed or not passed, having the president do an executive order without ever using the Congress is more desirable. At the same time, if you decide to use judicial restrictions and you have the Supreme Court come in and say, we don't think that the president should ever be able to declare a national state of emergency, that can hurt the court's credibility because it makes the Supreme Court look like they're activists and that they're willing to do whatever they believe, opposed to making the Supreme Court look like they're separate from politics, which is important for the court's legitimacy. So even though the affirmative says the Supreme Court should restrict the power, and the counterplan says the president should do it himself, and you could do them together, it's not desirable because of net benefits, because it still hurts the court's credibility. So you could take this course and my media and politics course, but maybe that pushes you to 24 credits, and that's going to be too hard for you to actually survive your extracurriculars and get a good grade in all the classes combined. So even though you theoretically could take 2 courses at the same time with me, it might not be desirable because of that. It might not be desirable because you don't know how I'm going to grade you, and you don't want to put yourself on the line at 2 courses at the same time. So maybe it's better to do one now and one later. And so it's sort of up to you to sort of explain why it's not desirable to do it at the same time. So those 2 things are extra credit. Quiz will just be like, what are the 2 ways you can prove a counterplan mutually exclusive? Right? The next thing you have to prove, which is one of the ways that you could prove that it's mutually exclusive, is the net benefits. Why the counterplan is better than the affirmative. At the start of the debate, presumption goes to the negative team, which means it's up to the affirmative to prove that they're better than the status quo. If they are exactly the same as the status quo, there's no reason to vote for them. We should just keep the status quo. The negative wins the debate round. So if there's a 1% reason for why the affirmative is better than the status quo, I go affirmative. But if there is not that 1% reason, you vote negative. With a counterplan, you have to prove that it's better than the affirmative, so presumption goes to the affirmative team. So if the counterplan is just as good as the affirmative, it's not a reason to vote against the affirmative. There might have been another class to take at 10:05, but it's just as good as this class. So why drop this class because you're already here? There's no reason to it. If they could prove that that is a better class, then there's the argument for why that's not beneficial. So the negative team has to prove that the counterplan is better than the affirmative plan, which is what the net benefit is. And the last thing a counterplan has to have is what is the status of the counterplan. And the quiz question that's attached to that one is what are the 2 ways you can run a counterplan? And they are conditional or unconditional. What unconditional means is that no matter what, at the end of the debate round, the negative team is going to advocate for that counterplan. What conditional means is that at any point during the debate, the negative team could say, you're right, the counterplan is a bad idea, I'm just going for the status quo. Or could argue 3 different counterplans if they want. So conditional means you could get rid of it. Unconditional means you're stuck advocating it. And so if you're going to run like, we should have an executive order to restrict the president's authority, you don't want to at the same time make arguments for why that restriction on power is bad if you're running it unconditionally, because you're also restricting that power, so you're just arguing against yourself. If you're running it conditionally, you'd be like, we think restrictions are bad, here's all those reasons. However, even if you think there should be restrictions, there's a better way to do that. Here's the counterplan. And at the end of the debate in the 2-1-R, you can tell the judges vote for the counterplan or the status quo. People generally ask, why would you ever do it unconditionally? It's because affirmative teams can argue that this is unfair because you can have multiple worlds and the affirmative is stuck defending one thing for the entirety of the debate. It's not fair if the negative could bring up 5 counterplans in the status quo and it spreads things too thin. If you run something unconditionally, it means you could think about a full 3-minute speech that's all cohesive, opposed to spending 3 minutes of half of your time arguing against yourself and sort of underdeveloping your argument. So there's strategic benefits to both, to both ways to go about doing it. There's no right or wrong. It's up to you to sort of debate what's better or more desirable. All right. So those are the steps that you have to prove within a counterplan. Questions on counterplans? Yeah.
Can you just repeat conditional and unconditional?
Conditional means that you could stop advocating at any point and go for the status quo. Unconditional means you have to advocate the counterplan no matter what. All right, so if you're doing something unconditional, you're really set on that's the better option. If you're doing it unconditionally, it's one argument that you've made in the debate round and you could go for others. All right. Any other questions? Okay. The next type of off-case argument is known as a critique, or K for short. Debate got critiques from the Germans first, so we spell it the German way with the K opposed to the QU. Doesn't really matter. But so critique is the third type of off-case argument. And what the critique is a philosophical indictment of the affirmative team. It could be that they're racist, sexist, homophobic, capitalist, speciest, whatever it is that you want. Something that the affirmative team has done that you're criticizing the way in which they go about approaching it. So one example of a critique that you could run would be like a gendered language critique. If your opponent keeps saying, he says this, he says that, and you're not a he, you could be like, this is a use of gendered language where they use he as a universal pronoun. This continues to erase women from educational spaces, just like the Constitution said all men were created equal, and that was used as a reason to deny women rights. Linguistically, continuously saying he as a universal pronoun pushes out women from debates and from educational spaces, and they should lose the debate round because of the gendered violence that it creates discursively. Now within that argument, you're going to have to win that discourse matters, that gendered violence, that gendered discourse affects gendered violence, and that gendered violence is something that needs to be able to be weighed against politics. But if you can win that argument, that's a critique that you can end up winning. And while it has nothing to do with the plan text proper, it has to do with what people are doing within the debate. And so if you remember fiat, fiat is the belief that when the judge votes affirmative, the plan passes. Critiques generally operate on what people call pre-fiat, which means what's happening in this room, right? So I told you when the judge votes affirmative, the plan passes, but you all know that at the end of the day, you're going to leave this classroom and we did not affect any legislation because none of us are actually policymakers, so we literally can't pass anything. So instead of talking about what the government should do, instead maybe we should talk about how we should relate to each other and how we interact with one another, right? If somebody came into this classroom and was using like racist and sexist slurs and kept on using the N-word, maybe even if they were really good at debating this topic, they should still lose the debate because they make it a hostile educational space that is unacceptable, and it's important for us to send a message saying, no, we should not use racist language within debates and you should lose the debate round for it. Now, if somebody loses the debate round because they said he is a universal pronoun, I promise you they're probably going to go home upset, talk to their friends, be like, I can't believe I lost this debate, I won everything, but I happened to say he, I didn't apologize, and now I'm stuck, I lost this, and now my grades hurt. And so suddenly, there's education that's taking place here and outside. And even if that creates like maybe a 0.001% chance of somebody's changing their language, that happens in the real world versus in the imaginary world of debate. And so maybe that's more important because it actually affects how we interact with each other as students and as educators versus just assuming that we're going to all become policymakers. All of those things are arguments that you have to win in debate round, and somebody who might have slipped up and said an offensive word can easily argue that discourse doesn't matter, that policy making is more important, we're here to talk about what the federal government should do, and that is a prior question to the way in which we interact with each other, because I could just say, I'm sorry I said this, now let's focus back on the meat of the matter. And when somebody says meat of the matter, you can run a speciesism critique because it assumes that meat and dead animal carcasses are actually the substance of something opposed to, other things that don't require the killing of animals. And so if you're interested in philosophy, you could run a nihilism critique if you want. Every affirmative is going to try and change the world. Nihilism would critique all of those attempts to change the world and saying that it's just going to create eternal resentment and that people are going to continuously be unhappy in the world that we exist in. And so it's better to just sort of reflect and accept the world as it is opposed to trying to change it. And so if you're a philosophy major or you like philosophy courses, if you've read like Heidegger, Nietzsche, Foucault, any of those people, you could utilize those arguments in critiques if you want. If you're more interested in policy making, you probably aren't going to run critiques as much. You're going to run counterplans and disads more, but you should be ready to explain why that's more important than philosophy. If you're writing critiques because you're more interested in it, you should be ready to explain why philosophy is more important than policy making. And again, all of this is going to be judged by myself and others using the rubric of anything that's conceded is taken as truth. So you'll check your individual beliefs, but in a good debate where people are going back and forth, these things might matter, in terms of it. And so when you read ballots and somebody's like, I think you shouldn't have used these terms, however, it's not responded to, and so, I can't vote against you because of it. If you're debating that person in the future, you should be like, okay, I'll make sure not to say this because they might call me out on it and I don't want to have that debate. Or you should just be like, okay, now I'll think of the answers that I'll say if people say it. Or you'll be like, maybe I should just not say this word because part of the class gets offended by saying this word. All up to you, but whatever choice you make in debate, The point is, you just have to be ready to defend it, because no matter what you say, there's a way for it to be attacked or critiqued or, or be debated, and the point of debate is to have those conversations. So whatever you pick, just be ready to defend it. In critiques, you have to prove a link. So you have to prove that they did the racist, sexist, homophobic, speciesist, classist thing that they said that you say they did. If they never used he as a universal pronoun, you can't call them out for using gendered language because they didn't use that, right? So you have to just prove that they did the thing that you said. For a nihilism critique, it's pretty easy because they're all trying to change the world, so they're not embracing nihilism. Then you have to prove an impact. Why is that bad? Generally, if you just leave it as, this is racist, this is sexist, you're going to lose the debate round because the affirmative will generally have impacts that are apocalyptic in scope, like maybe a nuclear war, maybe economic uncertainty that causes global economic collapse, or climate change that could destroy the entirety of the planet. And if you're like, but they said something sexist, and you're like, but the entire planet is going to die, most people are going to be like, I think extinction is more important than a little bit of sexism. But some of you might be sitting here saying that if somebody could say extinction is more important than a little bit of sexism, you're just belittling sexism. And then what you need to do is warrant out why sexism is connected to larger structures of inequality that allow for patriarchal systems, to allow for militarism, violence, whatever else it is. And so you connect that ism to sort of larger tangible issues, so that way it's not just like racism bad judge, but you warrant out and explain why racism is bad in response to the affirmative's harms from the 1AC. Then you need to have either an alternative or solvency. And this is where you say, sort of like with a counterplan, what should we do instead? And so you could say, rejecting somebody who says the N-word in debate will help be able to create community consensus that we shouldn't be saying those words in a classroom experience. And that will help change the way people act. And so you could just be like, voting against this team is good because it solves for the impacts of these problematic language and the things that we're doing in the debate round. If you're running a nihilism critique or a Buddhism critique, maybe you have an alternative that comes from Nietzsche or comes from Buddhist philosophy that explains why meditation is a better way to address these issues than, just trying to use policy. So you come up with what is the philosophical alternative. The difference between an alternative and a text for a counterplan is generally the government doing something that relies on fiat, whereas an alternative is more, what are we doing in the context of this room, right? And the affirmative team can argue, just rejecting me is not going to change my language. In fact, it's going to harden me to my beliefs, so I'm going to continuously say this. And so rejecting me on this critique doesn't solve. And if it doesn't solve, just because somebody said something, racist, is not going to eliminate racism. So why vote for somebody who's just pointing something out? So you have to prove that doing that actually has an impact. And then also with counterplans, you have to prove that it's mutually exclusive as well. So you have to prove that you can't do the alternative at the same time. I used he as a universal pronoun. I said I'm sorry. Isn't that good enough? You could criticize me for using this language. I'm not doing it again. Now pass my affirmative plan. And so the negative team would have to prove why that just allows for people to be hypocritical, allows for people to not actually have punishments for their actions, and that there needs to be a punishment for people to actually reform the way that they act. So basically, just like with the counterplan, that the ability to critique people in this way, it's an opportunity cost to voting for the affirmative team. All right? Any questions on critiques? All right. The last type of off-case argument is a procedural argument. And this is where you argue about the rules of the game. What should debate be? So if somebody talks too fast, you could run a procedural argument that says you talk too fast. You have to talk conversation speed, and this hurts our ability to debate. And if you can win that argument, they could lose the debate round. Even if everything they said was good, even if everybody here who was judging was able to understand things, but somebody who was an ESL speaker was like, you talk too fast for me, I couldn't understand, this hurts my fairness in debate. If you could win that argument, you could win the debate on a procedural violation. If somebody doesn't say if they're using statutory or judicial restrictions, and in their plan text just says, we believe the United States should increase statutory and or judicial restrictions, you could say, that's unfair because I don't know if you're using Congress or the judicial branch, and what I would do as the negative team is prepare for one or the other, but I don't know what you are, which means as soon as I prove Congress bad, you're like, oh, it's and or, so I'm actually only doing the courts, so you're able to be a moving target. there's a million different rules that you can make up. I've seen people say that you shouldn't use laptops in debate because it creates a class divide and a difference in terms of who has access to laptops and who doesn't have access to laptops, which creates economic inequality, which affects people's grades based upon not their intelligence, but based upon who's able to afford a laptop to bring to class. And I've seen people lose rounds because they brought a laptop to class, even though 90% of the people in that semester had laptops and were debating off of laptops, but one team that had laptops round one was like, I think this will be clever, and they decided to run this procedural argument instead of not bring laptops that day, and were able to convince the class that laptops were, a problematic tool procedurally because of the divides that it could theoretically create. Didn't stop the class from winning laptops, or using laptops, but they won that procedural argument more than once because they were just really good at explaining it, and no one decided to actually prepare reasons for why laptops were good. Most people were just like, come on, we have them, everyone has them, you had them, can't we just use them? And they warranted out why it was really bad and why they stopped doing it, and so they were prepared for that because they were clever enough to think, oh, I can come up with this procedural argument and warrant it all out. So you can really come up with a procedural argument based upon whatever you want, you just have to think about it and structure it out. First thing you need is interpretation. I spelled that wrong for some reason. But an interpretation is just what is the rule that you want to have advocated, right? So this is a rule, no laptops. Then you have a violation. They brought laptops. This is a rule, they violate that rule, right? If you're like, you have to speak at conversation speed, you have to then prove that they didn't speak at conversation speed. So you have this is what the rule is, here's how they violate a rule. Then you have reasons to prefer, or standards, which is why your rule is a good one. So making sure that everyone speaking conversation speed gives us the ability to have real life conversations with each other, makes it more accessible to a larger audience, makes sure that we're able to become good public speakers. Not having laptops, make sure that people who can't afford laptops aren't put at a disadvantage. Make sure that we're not using more energy from the classroom than necessary. Make sure that people who have faulty batteries aren't stopped from being able to participate in class. Just reasons why your rule is a good rule to have, right? Some people might say talking really fast is good because it allows for more depth. We only have 3 minutes. So if I could talk twice as fast, I could get twice the amount of content out, which means that we have more in-depth debates, which is more desirable because this class isn't about becoming a good public speaker, because there's oral communication classes for this. For that, this class is about learning to become good at arguing, so the more content we can get in gives us more knowledge and allows us to become better arguers. So you have to prove that your rule is a good one. And then you need to prove voting issues. Why is it worth voting on that rule? Once they've used laptops in the debate, it has made the debate impossible for it to ever hit a point of equity again. Once we could not understand their first speech, it's too little too late for them to just start talking slower in their second speech because now I've conceded too many points, right? So it's why it's worth voting on opposed to something else. For that laptop, I saw people against that team say, okay, I'll just stop using my laptop for the rest of the debate. So you don't have to vote against me. We agree, we shouldn't use laptops. We're not going to use our laptops anymore. And once that worked, and then after it worked, the other team that liked to run that procedural argument just came up with reasons for why that's not good enough and why it has to be a voting issue opposed to like there's another punishment that's involved. When I do mini golf with my kids who are 10 and 9, they sometimes double tap that ball a little bit, which is technically cheating, and I could say, you lose, you get the maximum strengths on this hole, but I'm much better than them at mini golf, so right now I let them do the double tap, and it's okay because it makes the game a little bit more competitive, so I don't think it's a voting issue. At some point, they will hit the age where it does become a voting issue because at some point it's important to learn that you can't cheat like this in this game. Some people would say when they were 5 years old, I should have done that because it teaches them not to cheat and the proper rules for the game. But those are all debatable points, and so you have to win that your procedural argument is enough of a reason for why the judges should vote against you, against the other team, and not listen to everything else in the debate. Just like with the critique, you have to prove to the judge that what you're criticizing is important enough to disregard all of those policy implications. You have to prove that this procedural argument is important enough to disregard all the other content in the debate because what they've done is so egregious that they should lose the debate because it's become so unfair or so bad for education. All right. Any questions? Yeah?
These are used in the rebuttal.
In the 1NC, the negative team will generally bring up off-case arguments and their on-case responses. So in that first speech, but then they continues through to the rebuttal. So when you debate, you might be like, I don't like critiques or procedural arguments, so I'm never going to run them. Entirely your choice. Same thing in the opposite direction. You might, though, decide, I'm going to run a dissad, a critique, and then come up with 3 reasons for why the affirmative doesn't solve for your opening speech. And at the end of the debate, you could go for the critique, the dissad, or one of the 3 reasons for why the affirmative doesn't solve, or a combination of them. So generally, the 1NC does a combination of off-case arguments and on-case arguments, and then by the 2&R on the rebuttals, they've picked which are their best arguments to go for. And same thing on the affirmative. They might have 3 harms for why we need to have a no first use policy, but in the end of the debate, they might only talk about one of those harms. So they might only talk about accidental nuclear war opposed to proliferation, because it's like, that's not as interesting right now. They've just been debated, but they've conceded this accidental nuclear war scenario. And so you present all of these in the sort of opening constructive speeches, and then you debate it out through the rebuttals. All right? Other questions? All right, so going through the quiz questions one by one to make sure that you have them all. What is the resolution? So you should be able to say that word for word. What is fiat? You should be able to give a definition for it. What is the order of the speeches? What are the time limits, which includes constructive, rebuttals, prep time, and cross-examination? Who cross-examines who? Yep.
What is fiat?
Fiat is, yep.
The judges.
The belief that if the judge votes affirmative, the plan actually happens. It comes into existence. Yep. Then, what is the SHIT? So you have to know what SHIT stands for and being able to give a sentence definition for each one of them. What are the 4 types of off-case arguments? So you're expected to be able to write dissent, counterclaim, critique, procedural with a 1-sentence definition for them. Then I will ask, I think 2 or 3 of them, what are the 4 parts you have to prove to a disadvantage or a critique? You don't need to have the definitions for it. You just have to be like text, mutually exclusive, net benefit status, if I ask that. What are the 2 ways you can run a counterclaim? Conditional, unconditional. And extra credit is what are the 2 ways you can prove a counterclaim is mutually exclusive. All right, those are all the quiz questions. Yep.
The answer to the question, what is fiat? Is it when the judge votes affirmative, the plan passes?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, if somebody said that it means that Trump can't veto it, that would be an acceptable answer. So something that shows that you know that negatives can't argue that it just won't happen.
When is the quiz?
The quiz will be put up on my courses on Tuesday of next week.
Oh, it's online.
Online, yep. So quiz is online on Tuesday next week. You have until Thursday of next week to do it. There's no physical class Tuesday and Thursday. It's just doing the quiz. I'll go there first. Yeah.
What did you say about like when you have to define an issue, you have to use it in a sentence?
No, just give like a 1-sentence definition. Solvency proves that they resolve the problems or take care of them.
Okay.
Something like that. Yep.
Is there a time limit on the quiz?
I'm not going to put a time limit on it, but it's like, from Tuesday to Thursday. Yeah. Other questions? All right. I believe that this should be a closed book quiz, but I'm clearly not there watching, but this is what I'm saying that I believe it should be. If it was a debate round and you used your notes, I would say it should be a voting issue, because that's how much I think you should just have this memorized. But again, I'm not there, so it's only just a reflection upon your own ethical self if you do something else. All right? Any other questions? Okay, so that's it. I'll not see you next week. I'll just see the quizzes, and then I will see you the week after that, and we'll do the second round of SPAR debates at that point.